In 1911, two guano miners named James Hart and David Pyute were digging through bat droppings in a Nevada cave when they pulled out something that would challenge everything we thought we knew about pre-Columbian America: human skeletons. With red hair still attached to the skulls, 6-foot-tall remains buried under layers of organic material that should have preserved only the bones. But the hair was there, bright red, unmistakable. And the Pyute tribe had been telling stories about red-haired giants for generations, stories the settlers dismissed as mythology, until 1911, when the mythology started walking out of the cave on the end of a shovel. However, what happened next is where the real story begins. Because those skeletons disappeared, the academic establishment wrote them off, and the cave that rewrote North American history became a footnote in dusty mining reports that almost nobody reads anymore. If you found this channel, you're already questioning the official timeline. Hit subscribe. You're in the right place. New videos every week on the history they don't want you examining too closely. Let's start with what we know for certain. Lovelock Cave sits about 20 miles south of the town of Lovelock, Nevada, in the dry lake bed that was once Lake Lahontan. During the Pleistocene epoch, this was a massive body of water, covering thousands of square miles. When the climate shifted and the lake receded, it left behind caves that became natural shelters. Lovelock Cave is one of them. A horseshoe-shaped cavity, roughly 150 feet deep and 35 feet wide, carved into the base of a tufa formation. For thousands of years, this cave accumulated layers of organic material, bat guano mostly. The stuff piled up in depths measuring 10 to 12 feet in some sections, and guano has value. In the early 1900s, fertilizer companies were mining bat caves all over the American Southwest. The nitrogen content made it agricultural gold. James Hart and David Pyute were working for the Lovelock Cave Mining Company. Their job was simple: dig out the guano, bag it, ship it. Standard commercial operation. They'd been working the cave since 1911, when they started hitting artifacts. Baskets, tools, textiles woven so tightly they could hold water. But that wasn't unusual. Plenty of Nevada caves showed signs of native occupation. What made them stop digging was pulling out a jawbone that was far too large to belong to any Pyute they'd ever seen. The jawbone measured nearly twice the size of a normal human mandible. Hart later described it in an interview with the Reno Evening Gazette as having teeth still intact, worn down but otherwise perfect, suggesting this wasn't some deformity or disease, but simply a very large person. They set it aside and kept digging, assuming it was an anomaly, maybe one unusually tall individual from a local tribe. Then came the skulls, then the long bones, then the full skeletons with tissue still clinging to them and hair, bright red hair, fanned out across the cave floor like it had been placed there yesterday. Hart's testimony from 1912 is still on record at the Churchill County Museum. He described finding the first complete skeleton about 8 feet down into the guano deposit, lying in a semi-flexed position as if the person had been buried deliberately. The skeleton was tall. Hart estimated 6.5 feet based on the length of the femur alone, and the skull had hair. Not just traces, not fragments. A full head of hair, matted and brittle from age but unmistakably red. Pyute corroborated this in his own statement, adding that the hair looked like it had been braided at one time, though the braids had mostly come apart during burial. They found more. Over the next several months, Hart and Pyute documented pulling out at least 15 partial skeletons from different sections of the cave, several of which had similar characteristics: tall stature, robust bone structure, and in at least 4 cases, red hair preserved well enough to identify coloring. The local Pyutes, who occasionally visited the mining operation to trade, weren't surprised. They told Hart and Pyute about the Sita. The stories matched what was coming out of the ground. Hart and Pyute weren't scientists, they were miners. So they did what miners do. They kept working and mentioned it to people in town. Word spread. By 1912, the cave had attracted attention from the University of California. But here's where the timeline gets interesting. The university didn't mount a formal excavation until 1924, 13 years after the initial discoveries. 13 years where the cave remained open to looters, curiosity seekers, and amateur collectors who walked out with whatever struck their fancy. When Llewellyn Loud from UC Berkeley's Museum of Anthropology finally arrived in 1924, he found the cave in shambles. Artifacts scattered, stratigraphy destroyed, and many of the most compelling finds already gone, sold to private collectors or sitting in someone's living room as conversation pieces. Loud did his best. He catalogued over 10,000 artifacts, duck decoys so sophisticated they rivaled modern hunting equipment. woven sandals that predated the supposed arrival of basket-weaving technology in the region. Fish hooks carved from bone with a level of detail that suggested specialization and surplus time, not the hand-to-mouth existence we're told characterized pre-agricultural societies. But the red-haired skeletons were already a problem. Loud found skeletal remains, yes. He documented them. But the truly giant specimens, the ones with intact red hair that Hart and Pugh described in their testimonies, those weren't in his catalogue. Some researchers claim Loud's team found red hair on several skulls. Others say the hair was brown or black and only appeared reddish due to mineral staining from the cave environment. The academic establishment settled on the mineral explanation and moved on. However, there's a problem with the mineral staining theory. The Pyutes had been telling the same story for generations before 1911. They called them the Sitakar, the Chul Eaters, red-haired giants who lived on rafts made of tule reeds in the ancient lake. According to Pyute oral history, the Sitakar were not friendly. They raided Pyute camps, kidnapped women, cannibalized victims. The Pyute tribes eventually united against them, drove them into Lovelock Cave, and set fire to the entrance. Anyone who tried to escape was killed. The ones who stayed inside suffocated. But the oral tradition goes deeper than that simple narrative. Pyute elders described the Sitakar as master boat builders who could navigate the lake in weather that would capsize Pyute canoes. They constructed large rafts capable of carrying entire families and their possessions, floating villages that moved with the seasons following fish migrations and waterfowl patterns. The Pyutes traded with them initially, exchanging obsidian and rabbit skins for lake fish and woven tule mats. The relationship was tense, but functional. The conflict began, according to the oral histories, when the lake started shrinking. As the water receded, the Sitakar lost their advantage. Their floating settlements became stranded on mudflats. The fish populations they depended on collapsed. Desperation turned them violent. The raids started small. Theft of food stores. Then it escalated. Kidnappings. Entire Pyute families disappearing near the shoreline. Bodies found with evidence of ritual cannibalism, not survival cannibalism. This wasn't people starving. This was cultural practice. The Pyute response was coordinated across multiple bands, something that rarely happened. Different Pyute groups had their own territories and disputes, but the Sitakar threat unified them. They tracked the remaining giants to Lovelock Cave, the last refuge where fresh water still seeped through the rock. The siege lasted weeks. The Pyutes piled brush and driftwood at the cave entrance and set it ablaze. Smoke filled the interior. A few Sitakar tried to fight their way out and were killed with arrows and clubs. The rest suffocated inside. Sarah Winnemucca Hopkins, a prominent Pyute author and activist, published these stories in 1882, nearly 30 years before the miners pulled out the first skeleton. Her grandfather told her the Sitakar stood between 6 and 10 feet tall, had red hair, and spoke a language the Pyutes couldn't understand. She wrote this in Life Among the Putes, a book you can still find today if you look hard enough. But she included details that didn't make it into the condensed versions most people cite. She described the Sitakar as having lighter skin than the Pyutes, almost pale, which they attributed to spending their lives on the water, away from direct sun. She mentioned their weapons, long spears with obsidian points that were larger and heavier than anything the Pyutes used, designed for a people with greater physical strength. The academic establishment dismissed it as folklore, mythology, the kind of exaggerated campfire tale that couldn't possibly reflect historical reality. But when Hart and Pugh started pulling out 6-foot skeletons with red hair in 1911, the Pyutes weren't surprised. They'd been saying this for generations. And here's the uncomfortable part. If the Pyutes were right about the red hair, and right about the giants, and right about the cave, what else were they right about that we've written off as primitive superstition? Now let's talk about the artifacts themselves, because this is where Lovelock Cave moves from interesting to paradigm-threatening. The duck decoys found in the cave are masterpieces of engineering. They're made from tule reeds, bundled and shaped to mimic the profile of a duck floating on water. Feathers are attached to the top. The weight distribution is perfect. You could drop one of these into a lake today and fool actual ducks. Carbon dating puts some of these decoys at over 2,000 years old. But the design suggests a culture with surplus resources, specialized knowledge, and enough free time to perfect a tool that's only useful if you're already eating well enough that you can dedicate energy to making hunting more efficient. That's not supposed to exist in pre-Columbian Nevada. We're told these were subsistence-level societies, hand-to-mouth, nomadic. Every calorie spent on survival. Except the evidence in Lovelock Cave tells a different story. These people had time, they had specialization, They had culture complex enough to weave baskets so tight they could hold water without leaking. And then there's the tule reed technology itself. Tules are marsh plants. They grow in shallow water. Lake Lahontan was that shallow water 10,000 years ago. But the lake dried up. The tule beds disappeared. So how were the Sitakar building tule rafts in a region that no longer supported tule growth? Either they were living there when the lake still existed, which pushes the timeline back thousands of years, or they were transporting tule from hundreds of miles away, which suggests trade networks we're told didn't exist yet. Loud's 1,924 excavation found textile fragments woven in patterns that match styles found in coastal California and the Pacific Northwest. Not local styles, coastal styles. Imported or learned from coastal cultures, which means contact, which means trade, which means these isolated desert societies weren't isolated at all. In 1936, a second excavation was conducted by Mark Harrington from the Southwest Museum. Harrington had access to better funding and more time. He excavated deeper into the cave and found stratigraphic layers that Loud had missed. The oldest layers, the ones buried under 10 feet of guano and debris, contained artifacts that dated back over 4,000 years. But here's where it gets strange. The deeper Harrington dug, the more advanced the artifacts became. In conventional archaeology, you expect the opposite. Primitive tools at the bottom, sophisticated tools at the top. Cultural evolution moving upward through time. Lovelock Cave showed the reverse. The deepest, oldest layers contained the finest basketry, the most intricate textiles, and the most sophisticated tools. The upper layers, the more recent occupation, showed a decline in craftsmanship, as if the culture that built the advanced artifacts had been replaced by a less advanced one. Harrington documented this. He published his findings. And the academic establishment explained it away as regional variation or contamination from later disturbances. But the stratigraphy was clear. The deeper you went, the better the work. Something was living in that cave thousands of years ago that knew things we didn't think anyone in North America knew yet. And then they disappeared. Now here's where the Tartaria angle comes in. Because if you've been following the revisionist history community, you know the theory. A global advanced civilization existed before the current historical record. It built massive structures, controlled advanced technology, left traces all over the world in the form of architecture, metallurgy, and engineering that shouldn't exist according to the standard timeline. Then something catastrophic happened. A flood, a pole shift, a deliberate reset. The civilization collapsed. The knowledge was lost. Surviving populations regressed to primitive states, and the people who emerged in the aftermath had to rebuild from scratch while sitting on top of ruins they couldn't explain. Lovelock Cave fits this pattern uncomfortably well. Advanced artifacts at the bottom, decline toward the top, a sudden disappearance of the people who made the advanced items, and oral histories describing giants, catastrophic floods, and lost peoples who came before. Lake Lahontan itself is evidence of catastrophic climate change. At its peak, this lake covered over 8,600 square miles. Today it's gone. The standard explanation is gradual climate shift over thousands of years as the Ice Age ended and the region dried out. But geological evidence from the lake bed shows signs of sudden drainage events, rapid water level drops, shorelines that shouldn't exist if the lake receded gradually. Some geologists have proposed that catastrophic flooding events periodically drained the lake through subsurface fissures, only to refill when the climate shifted again. The evidence for rapid drainage is visible today, if you know what to look for. The tufa formations surrounding the former lakebed show multiple distinct terraces, each representing a stable water level that lasted long enough for calcium carbonate to precipitate and build up. But between these terraces are steep drop-offs with no gradual transition, suggesting the water level didn't slowly lower, but dropped suddenly, leaving behind stranded shorelines at different elevations. Core samples taken from the lakebed sediment show layers of desiccation cracks, indicating periods when the mud dried out completely and rapidly, then was covered again by new sediment when water returned. This isn't the pattern you'd see from gradual evaporation. This is repeated catastrophic drainage and refilling. The timescales involved are debated, but some evidence suggests these events could have happened within years or even months, not millennia. If Lake Lahontan experienced sudden catastrophic drainage, anyone living on tule rafts in the middle of that lake would have had a very bad day. The Sitakar, if they existed, would have found their floating settlements stranded on dry land almost overnight. The tule beds they depended on would die off within a growing season once the water was gone. The fish populations would collapse immediately, trapped in shrinking pools that evaporated under the Nevada sun. Survival would require moving to the caves where natural springs still provided water and competing with the land-based Pyute tribes for increasingly scarce resources. What makes this scenario more than speculation is that it matches the oral history timeline. The Pyutes describe the Sitakar becoming violent when the waters receded, not gradually more desperate over generations, but suddenly hostile as their world disappeared. The archaeological layers in Lovelock Cave support this. The deepest strata show evidence of planned occupation, organized storage of food supplies, sophisticated artifacts suggesting stable long-term habitation. The upper layers show signs of desperate survival. Fewer artifacts, lower quality craftsmanship, burnt animal bones cracked open for marrow, suggesting people extracting every possible calorie from their kills. This is what sudden environmental collapse looks like in the archaeological record. That's one explanation for why the Sitakar ended up in Lovelock Cave, and why the Pyutes remember them as hostile invaders rather than peaceful neighbors. Displaced climate refugees fighting for survival don't make good neighbors. But let's go back to the red hair, because that's the detail that won't go away. Red hair is a genetic trait most commonly associated with European populations. It's caused by a mutation in the MC1R gene. The highest concentrations of red hair in the world are found in Scotland and Ireland, where up to 13% of the population carries the trait. In Native American populations, naturally occurring red hair is extremely rare, appearing in less than 1% of individuals. So how did red-haired skeletons end up in a Nevada cave thousands of years before European contact? The academic explanation is mineral staining. The high alkaline content of the guano and the cave environment chemically altered the hair pigment, making dark hair appear reddish. That's plausible. It happens. But Hart and Pugh were guano miners. They'd been working in bat caves for years. They knew what mineral-stained organic material looked like, and they described the hair as red, not brownish, not reddish-brown, red. Several researchers who examined the Lovelock remains before they disappeared also described red hair. Dr. Bruce McKenna, a biologist who examined some of the remains in the 1980s, reported finding hair samples that retained a distinctly reddish hue inconsistent with mineral staining alone. His analysis suggested the presence of pheomelanin, the pigment responsible for red hair in humans. If McKenna's analysis is accurate, then we have a biological problem. Red-haired humans in Nevada 4,000 years ago means either a European population reached North America thousands of years before Columbus, or the genetic mutation for red hair appeared independently in a Native American population at a rate statistically improbable given what we know about MC1R distribution. Or there's a third option, the one the Tartaria researchers talk about. A globally distributed advanced population existed before the current timeline. That population had genetic diversity we now associate with specific regions, but back then was simply human diversity. When the civilization collapsed, isolated populations retained different genetic markers. Some became Europeans, some became Native Americans, some became the Sitakar in Nevada. And the physical evidence of overlap, the red-haired giants in North American caves, got buried, destroyed, or dismissed because it didn't fit the approved narrative. Let's examine what happened to the physical evidence, because that's the part of this story that should make you uncomfortable. The red-haired skeletons that Hart and Pugh pulled out in 1911 were initially stored in local collections. Some went to the Humboldt Museum in Winnemucca, Nevada. Others were sold to private collectors. A few ended up at the Nevada State Museum. When Loud arrived in 1924, he documented skeletal remains, but not the giant red-haired specimens the miners described. By the time Harrington excavated in 1936, even more of the original material had disappeared. Here's where it gets specific. In 1929, the Humboldt Museum transferred several crates of Lovelock material to the Nevada State Museum in Carson City for long-term storage. The transfer manifest listed skeletal remains as part of the shipment. But when researchers tried to locate those remains in the 1950s for comparative study, the museum reported they couldn't find them. The crates had been moved during a renovation. The skeletal material was listed as missing, presumed lost during the move. In 1967, a fire destroyed part of the Nevada State Museum's storage facility. Several Lovelock Cave artifacts were lost, including skeletal remains. The fire started in a back storage room where older collections were kept, the exact section where the 1,929 transfer from Humboldt would have been stored. Convenient. In 1984, another storage reorganization at the Humboldt Museum resulted in additional material being discarded or lost. The official explanation was that duplicate cataloging had created confusion about which artifacts were truly unique, so administrators made executive decisions about what to keep. The red-haired skull fragments that had remained at Humboldt were part of what got discarded. Also convenient. What remains today are fragments. A few bone samples stored at the Nevada State Museum, some artifacts at the Smithsonian, though those are mostly textiles and tools, not the controversial skeletal material. The red-haired skulls that would settle this debate definitively, gone, lost to time, fires, administrative reshuffling. And there's a pattern within the pattern. Every time a researcher specifically requested access to examine the Lovelock skeletal material for red hair analysis or giant stature verification, they hit a wall. In 1952, anthropologist Dr. Sidney Wheeler formally requested permission to examine the remains for a comparative study on pre-Columbian populations. He was told the material was unavailable due to ongoing conservation work. 3 years later, he made the same request. This time, he was told the material had been transferred to another institution for specialized analysis. When he asked which institution, he never received a response. Wheeler gave up and moved on to other research. You can chalk that up to coincidence if you want, or you can recognize a pattern, because this isn't unique to Lovelock Cave. All over North America, skeletal remains that don't fit the Bering Strait migration model have a strange habit of disappearing. The Smithsonian has a well-documented history of acquiring unusual skeletal remains from burial mounds, only for those remains to vanish from catalogue records decades later. Researchers who request access to examine them are told the material is lost, destroyed, or never existed despite published reports stating otherwise. The Kennewick Man skeleton found in Washington in 1996 is one of the few examples that survived long enough for modern analysis. Carbon dating put him at over 9,000 years old. Forensic reconstruction of his skull showed Caucasoid features, not Native American. DNA analysis revealed genetic markers more common in Polynesian and European populations than in the tribes claiming ancestral connection. The legal battle over his remains lasted 20 years and involved federal intervention, tribal lawsuits, and congressional hearings. In 2017, he was finally reburied under the Native American Graves Protection and Repatriation Act, ending any possibility of further study. Lovelock Cave could have been another Kennewick Man, but it happened 85 years too early, before radiocarbon dating, before DNA analysis, before forensic anthropology had tools sophisticated enough to definitively prove what those skeletons were. So the evidence disappeared, the narrative was written, and anyone who asks uncomfortable questions gets labeled a pseudo-archaeologist. However, there's something else in that cave that doesn't disappear as easily: the sandals. Over 60 sandals were recovered from Lovelock Cave during the excavations. They're woven from plant fiber in a distinctive spiral pattern that's been carbon dated to between 9,000 and 10,000 years old. That's older than the oldest known sandals in the Middle East, older than agriculture in Mesopotamia. These are the oldest directly dated footwear in the world, and they're sitting in a Nevada cave that mainstream archaeology insists was occupied by primitive hunter-gatherers who didn't develop complex weaving techniques until thousands of years later. The sandals don't fit the timeline, neither do the duck decoys, neither do the watertight baskets, neither do the red-haired skeletons. So, the establishment picks and chooses. The sandals get celebrated as evidence of early human ingenuity. The baskets get displayed in museums as examples of Native American craftsmanship. And the red-haired giants get dismissed as folklore, mineral staining, and the overactive imaginations of guano miners who didn't know what they were looking at. But the miners knew what they were looking at. They were pulling human remains out of the ground. Remains that were tall, remains that had red hair, remains that matched the stories the Pyutes had been telling for generations. And instead of investigating, the academic establishment buried it, literally. Now let's connect this to the broader Tartaria theory, because Lovelock Cave isn't isolated. All over the world we find evidence of advanced prehistorical cultures that supposedly didn't exist. Göbekli Tepe in Turkey is 11,600 years old, built by hunter-gatherers who somehow organized labor forces to carve 2-0-ton stone pillars and arrange them in astronomically aligned circles. The Younger Dryas impact hypothesis suggests a catastrophic comet strike 12,800 years ago triggered global climate collapse, mass extinctions, and the sudden end of the Ice Age. Genetic analysis of Native American populations shows anomalous DNA markers that don't fit the Bering Strait migration model, including haplogroups more commonly found in Europe and the Middle East. And then there's the flood mythology. Every culture on Earth has flood stories. The Epic of Gilgamesh, Noah's Ark, the Hindu Matsya, Chinese Gunyu. Native American tribes across North and South America tell stories of great floods that destroyed the world before this one. The Hopi describe multiple world ages, each ending in catastrophe. The Pyutes describe the time when the waters covered the land and only the mountain peaks remained. Lake Lahontan was one of those floods. At its peak, this lake covered the entire region where Lovelock Cave now sits. The cave itself would have been underwater or accessible only by boat. When the water receded, it left behind shoreline terraces, tufa formations, and caves filled with sediment from a lake that no longer exists. The people who lived on that lake, the Sitakar floating on their chul rafts, would have watched their entire world drain away. The ones who survived would have moved into the caves. And when resources ran out and conflict with the Pyutes became inevitable, they made their last stand in a horseshoe-shaped cavity that became their tomb. The Pyutes remember this. They passed the story down for generations, and when Hart and Pugh started pulling out the skeletons, the Pyutes said, "We told you so. We've been telling you for hundreds of years. The red-haired giants were real. Lovelock Cave was their grave. And you didn't believe us until the evidence was too overwhelming to ignore. Then you made the evidence disappear." That's the pattern. Advanced artifacts appear in places they shouldn't. Skeletal remains don't match the approved migration models. Oral histories describe lost civilizations, giants, floods, and catastrophic resets. Researchers who take these stories seriously get marginalized. Evidence that contradicts the timeline gets lost, and the official narrative continues, as if none of this ever happened. But it did happen. Lovelock Cave is real. The artifacts are real. The sandals, the baskets, the duck decoys, all of it real, and sitting in museums right now. You can go see them if you want. The red-haired skeletons? Those are gone. Conveniently gone. But the testimony of the people who saw them, the published reports from researchers who examined them, and the oral histories of the Pyutes who warned us they were there, those are still here. And they're telling a story that doesn't fit the textbook version of history. If you're starting to question what else they've been lying about, you're not alone. This channel exists because the official narrative has holes you can drive a truck through. Every week, we examine the evidence they want buried. The artifacts they can't explain. The timelines that don't make sense. Subscribe if you want more. Next week, we're diving into the Michigan relics, another case of advanced pre-Columbian artifacts that disappeared after threatening the historical consensus. The question isn't whether advanced civilizations existed before the current timeline. The evidence says they did. The question is why the establishment works so hard to make sure you never seriously consider that possibility. What are they protecting? What does the real timeline look like? And how much of what we've been taught is designed to keep us from asking these questions? Lovelock Cave is just one cave in Nevada, but it's a crack in the narrative. And once you see the crack, you start noticing them everywhere.